She thought she could throw her out like she meant nothing, but in less than 10 minutes, that single decision would cost her everything she believed she controlled. The late afternoon light spilled through the towering glass windows of the boutique, casting golden reflections across polished marble floors that echoed softly with every confident step taken inside. Designer handbags lined the walls like trophies of status, each one more expensive than most people's monthly rent, and the air carried a faint scent of vanilla and wealth, a kind of quiet exclusivity that whispered who belonged and who didn't. Emily Carter stepped inside without hesitation, her white cotton blouse simple but clean, her jeans slightly worn at the edges, and her sneakers carrying the faint dust of a long day. She didn't look around in awe like most first-time visitors. Instead, her gaze was steady, observant, as if she were simply stepping into another ordinary place. A few heads turned immediately, not because she made noise, but because she didn't match the room. Near the center display, Victoria Blake stood surrounded by two sales associates, her tailored navy dress fitting perfectly, her heels clicking sharply against the marble as she pivoted slightly to glance at Emily. Victoria didn't need to say anything at first. Her eyes did the work for her, scanning Emily from head to toe in less than a second, categorizing, dismissing. It was a look she had perfected over years, the silent judgment that separated people into two groups, those who belonged and those who didn't. Emily paused briefly near a display of leather handbags, her fingers brushing lightly over the stitching of one piece, appreciating the craftsmanship rather than the price tag. "Can I help you?" one of the associates asked, though the question carried more hesitation than hospitality. Emily offered a small, polite smile. "I was just looking," she said softly. Her voice didn't rise above the ambient music, but it carried a quiet confidence that didn't quite match her appearance. Victoria watched from a distance, her lips curling slightly, amused by what she clearly saw as a misplaced presence. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate, her heels marking each second like a countdown. "This section is for premium clients," Victoria said, her tone smooth but edged with something colder underneath. The room shifted subtly. Conversations lowered. Even the soft music seemed to fade into the background. Emily turned to face her, her expression calm, her posture relaxed. "I understand," she replied gently, though she didn't move away. Victoria tilted her head, studying her more closely now, as if trying to understand how someone like Emily could stand there without shrinking. "Do you?" Victoria asked, her voice dropping just enough to carry across the room. "Because people who understand usually don't wander into places they clearly don't belong." A faint murmur rippled through the nearby customers, subtle but unmistakable. The sales associates exchanged quick glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Emily's hand lowered from the handbag, her fingers resting at her side. For a brief moment, there was a stillness about her, not of hesitation, but of quiet calculation. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply met Victoria's gaze, her eyes steady, unshaken. And in that silence, something shifted, though no one could quite explain it yet. Victoria misread it completely. She took a small step closer, her presence looming just enough to assert control. "I think it's best if you leave," she said, her voice now firm, decisive. "We like to keep a certain standard here." The words landed clean, sharp, designed to humiliate without raising her tone. Around them, the boutique fell into a near hush, every movement slowing as if the entire room was waiting to see what Emily would do next. Emily inhaled softly, her gaze flickering for just a second toward the entrance, where the glass doors reflected the street outside. Then she looked back at Victoria, her expression unchanged, her voice calm and almost too composed. "Are you sure that's what you want to do?" she asked quietly. Victoria smiled, a confident, effortless smile that had never once been challenged. "I'm absolutely sure," she replied. And in that moment, she had no idea that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her life. The words hung in the air like a quiet verdict, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the entire boutique had stopped breathing. Victoria Blake folded her arms with practiced elegance, her posture straight, her chin lifted just enough to signal that the conversation was already over in her mind. Around them, the sales associates shifted uncomfortably, their polite smiles frozen as they waited for Emily to comply, because in places like this, people always complied. Emily Carter did not move. She stood exactly where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her expression calm, as though the pressure in the room did not belong to her at all. That was what unsettled them first. It was not defiance. It was not arrogance. It was the absence of reaction. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing something she could not quite define, but she quickly dismissed it. People like Emily were predictable. They either apologized or they left. "I will not repeat myself," Victoria said, her voice quieter now, but far more pointed. "You are making everyone here uncomfortable." A subtle lie, delivered with confidence. A few customers looked away, pretending not to listen, while others leaned in just slightly, drawn by the tension unfolding in front of them. Emily's gaze drifted briefly across the room, taking in the polished surfaces, the carefully curated displays, the people who watched without speaking. Then her eyes returned to Victoria, steady and composed. "I am not here to cause any trouble," she said softly. "I just wanted to take a look." Victoria let out a small, humorless laugh, the kind that carried more judgment than amusement. "And you have seen enough," she replied. "Now it is time for you to go." One of the associates stepped forward hesitantly, as if preparing to escort Emily out, but paused when Emily finally shifted her weight and reached into her bag. The movement was slow, deliberate, drawing every eye in the room without a single raised voice. For a second, it looked like she might pull out a wallet, perhaps an attempt to prove something, to justify her presence in a way that Victoria would accept. Instead, Emily glanced at her phone, her thumb brushing lightly across the screen as if checking the time. Her expression did not change, but there was a quiet certainty in the gesture, something that did not belong to someone being dismissed. Victoria noticed it. An irritation flickered across her face. "This is not a place to linger," she said sharply. "If you need directions, I am sure there are more appropriate stores a few blocks down." A few people let out faint, awkward chuckles, unsure whether they were expected to find the comment amusing. Emily slipped her phone back into her bag without a word, her calm unbroken. "I will be leaving soon," she said, her tone even. "I just wanted to make sure you were certain about your decision." The sentence landed differently this time. It was still polite, still quiet, but it carried a weight that did not match her appearance. Victoria's smile tightened, her patience thinning. "I have never been more certain," she replied. "Security can escort you if necessary." The word security shifted the atmosphere again, turning discomfort into something heavier. One of the associates glanced toward the entrance, as if expecting someone to appear, while another adjusted a display that did not need adjusting, desperate to avoid eye contact. Emily gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a final confirmation rather than a threat. "All right," she said simply. And then she turned, not hurried, not embarrassed, but composed, walking toward the glass doors with a quiet dignity that felt out of place in a moment designed to diminish her. The soft echo of her footsteps followed her across the marble floor, each step measured, unshaken. Victoria watched her go, a faint sense of satisfaction settling in, the kind that came from restoring order, from reminding someone of their place. Yet something lingered beneath it, something she could not name, like a detail that refused to fit. Just as Emily reached the entrance, the distant sound of a car pulling up outside cut through the silence. It was subtle at first, the low hum of an engine far more refined than the traffic that passed by moments before. A few heads turned instinctively toward the glass, curiosity breaking through. The tension. Emily paused for the briefest second, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, her reflection catching the golden light. Then, without turning back, she stood there, waiting, as if she had been expecting that exact moment all along. Inside the boutique, Victoria exhaled slowly, her confidence intact, unaware that the scene she believed was ending had only just begun. The low, refined hum outside grew louder, smoother than any ordinary vehicle, carrying a presence that did not need to announce itself to be noticed. Through the boutique's glass facade, a sleek black luxury sedan eased to a stop directly at the curb, its polished surface reflecting the fading gold of the late afternoon sun like liquid metal. Conversations inside the store died instantly, replaced by a quiet curiosity that spread from one customer to the next. One of the sales associates instinctively stepped closer to the window, her eyes narrowing as recognition flickered across her face, though she could not yet place it. Emily Carter remained still at the door, her hand resting lightly on the handle, her posture composed, as if the unfolding moment was neither surprising nor urgent. Behind her, Victoria Blake exhaled through her nose, her patience already spent. "This is exactly what I meant," she said, her voice low but edged with irritation. "People linger, create scenes, and suddenly everyone thinks they belong here." Her words were meant to reclaim control, to re-establish the invisible hierarchy she relied on, but fewer people were listening now. Their attention had shifted to the vehicle outside, where the driver stepped out first, dressed in a tailored black suit that spoke of precision and discipline. He moved quickly to the rear door, opening it with a quiet efficiency that carried its own kind of authority. The door opened, and for a brief second, nothing happened. Then a man stepped out. Daniel Carter did not rush. He did not look around to assess the scene. He simply emerged, straightening slightly as his shoes touched the pavement, his presence commanding attention without effort. His charcoal suit fit him with exact precision, his posture relaxed but unmistakably controlled, and there was something in the way he carried himself that made even strangers instinctively step aside. Inside the boutique, the shift was immediate, though subtle. A customer near the window straightened, recognizing something she could not quite articulate. One of the associates inhaled sharply, her eyes widening as memory connected with recognition. Victoria, however, had not turned yet. She remained focused on Emily, her confidence intact, unaware that the balance of the room had already begun to change. "I suggest you leave now," Victoria said, her tone final, as if sealing the outcome with her words alone. Emily did not respond. Instead, she gently pushed the door open, the soft chime above it ringing once, clear and delicate. The sound seemed to cut through the room like a signal. Daniel's gaze lifted immediately, finding her without hesitation. For the first time since he stepped out of the car, his expression shifted, the smallest hint of warmth crossing his otherwise composed features. He walked toward the entrance with measured steps, neither hurried nor slow, each movement deliberate, as though the space itself adjusted to accommodate him. Emily stepped just outside, the light catching her face as she looked up at him. "You are right on time," she said quietly, her voice calm, almost conversational. Daniel glanced briefly toward the boutique interior, his eyes scanning the room in a single, precise motion, taking in the tension, the stillness, the eyes that watched. "I had a feeling I might be needed," he replied, his tone even, though there was an undercurrent of awareness that suggested he already understood more than anyone had said. Inside, Victoria finally turned, drawn by the subtle shift in attention, by the way the room no longer revolved around her voice. Her eyes landed on Daniel, and for a fraction of a second, her expression remained unchanged, still anchored in the confidence of someone who believed she controlled every situation she entered. Then something flickered. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Recognition did not arrive all at once. It crept in, piece by piece, carried by details she could not ignore. The precision of his suit, the quiet authority in his posture, the way the driver remained perfectly still by the car, waiting, the way the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Victoria's lips parted slightly, her thoughts catching up to what her eyes were beginning to understand. Across the boutique, one of the associates lowered her voice to a whisper that was barely contained. "That is Daniel Carter." The name moved through the room like a current, soft but undeniable. A few customers exchanged quick glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to realization. Victoria stood frozen for just a moment longer, her earlier certainty beginning to fracture in ways she could not yet control. Outside, Emily remained calm, her gaze steady, as if nothing had changed at all. But everything had already begun to change. And inside that quiet realization, the first crack in Victoria's world had already formed. The name did not need to be repeated twice for the atmosphere to collapse under its weight. Daniel Carter. It lingered in the air like a quiet verdict, undeniable and irreversible. Victoria Blake felt it before she fully processed it, a subtle shift beneath her confidence, like the ground had moved just enough to throw off her balance. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides, the polished composure she had perfected now working harder to stay intact. She had heard the name before, of course. Everyone in her circle had. It was the kind of name that did not need introductions, tied to boardrooms, acquisitions, and quiet decisions that changed entire industries overnight. But hearing it and standing in front of it were two very different things. Outside the glass doors, Daniel stood beside Emily with an ease that spoke of familiarity, not performance. He did not ask what had happened immediately. He did not need to. His eyes had already read the room, the tension, the silence that was too heavy to be accidental. "Would you like to go somewhere else?" he asked her, his voice calm, almost gentle, as though they were discussing something ordinary. Emily shook her head slightly, her expression still composed. "No," she replied softly. "I think this is where I needed to be." That answer carried more meaning than the words themselves, and Daniel understood it instantly. He gave a small nod, then turned toward the boutique entrance, his gaze steady as he stepped forward. Inside, the shift intensified. The sales associates straightened instinctively, their earlier uncertainty replaced by a sharp awareness of who now stood at their door. One of them moved quickly to adjust her posture, her voice catching as she tried to prepare a greeting that suddenly felt insufficient. Victoria remained where she was, but her stance had changed, just enough to reveal the crack forming beneath her certainty. She watched as Daniel crossed the threshold, the soft chime of the door echoing once more, this time carrying a different kind of weight. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked in, his presence filling the space in a way that no title or introduction could replicate. Every step seemed to draw the room tighter, pulling attention toward him without effort. He stopped a few feet from Victoria, not invading her space, but not yielding it either. The silence between them stretched, thick and undeniable. Victoria's smile returned, but it was no longer effortless. It was controlled, calculated, the kind of smile that tried to repair something that had already begun to break. "Good afternoon," she said, her tone carefully measured. "If there has been any misunderstanding." Daniel lifted his hand slightly, not abruptly, but enough to pause her words before they could finish. It was not a gesture of aggression. It was a gesture of clarity. "I prefer to hear it from her," he said calmly, his voice even but firm, his eyes briefly shifting toward Emily before returning to Victoria. The room went completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the faint music seemed to fade into nothing. Emily stepped back inside, her footsteps quiet against the marble, her presence no longer dismissed, no longer invisible. She stood beside Daniel, not behind him, not shielded, but equal, her calm unwavering. "I was asked to leave," she said simply, her voice carrying just enough to reach everyone in the room. No embellishment. No accusation. Just the truth. Victoria felt the words land, not loudly, but precisely, each one removing a piece of the narrative she had tried to control. She opened her mouth to respond, to reframe, to explain, but the space for that had already narrowed. Daniel's gaze remained steady, not confrontational, but impossible to ignore. "On what grounds?" he asked quietly. It was not a question that needed volume. It carried its own weight. Victoria hesitated, and in that hesitation, the room saw what she could not hide. Her certainty, once effortless, now required effort. "We maintain a certain environment here," she began, her voice slightly tighter than before. "And sometimes that means ensuring that." She stopped, because even she could hear how it sounded now. The justification that once felt natural now felt exposed under the light of a different perspective. Daniel did not interrupt. He did not challenge her directly. He simply let the silence stretch, allowing her words to stand on their own. And in that silence, something irreversible settled over the room. The balance had shifted completely. Victoria was no longer the one defining who belonged. And for the first time, she realized she might not be the one in control at all. Victoria Blake felt the silence closing in around her, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy in a way she could not push aside. For years, she had controlled rooms like this with nothing more than a glance, a tone, a single decisive sentence. But now, every word she had spoken moments ago seemed to echo back at her with a different meaning, stripped of authority and exposed under a new light. She straightened her posture slightly, reclaiming what composure she could, her chin lifting just enough to signal that she was not finished. "This establishment has standards," she said, her voice carefully measured, though the sharp certainty from before had softened into something more cautious. We reserve the right to maintain an environment that reflects our clientele. The sentence was polished, practiced, and designed to sound reasonable. But the room did not respond the way it once would have. No one nodded. No one supported her. Instead, there was only stillness, the kind that made every word linger longer than intended. Daniel Carter watched her without interruption, his expression unchanged, his presence steady. He did not react immediately, and that silence forced Victoria's explanation to stand on its own, without reinforcement, without escape. Emily stood beside him, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her gaze calm, almost detached, as though she were observing something inevitable rather than personal. Daniel finally spoke, his tone even, controlled, but carrying a quiet weight that did not need emphasis. Standards are important, he said, but they are only meaningful when they are applied with fairness. The words were simple, but they shifted the atmosphere again, drawing a clear line without raising his voice. Victoria felt it. She opened her mouth to respond, but paused, recalculating, searching for footing that was no longer there. Of course, she replied quickly. And perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. We did not realize, she stopped herself again, because finishing that sentence would confirm exactly what she was now trying to avoid. Daniel's gaze did not waver. You did not realize what? He asked quietly. The question was not aggressive, but it was precise, leaving no space to hide behind vague explanations. A faint flush rose along Victoria's cheeks, subtle but undeniable. Around the room, the tension tightened further. The associates stood motionless, their earlier confidence replaced by careful attention, aware that every word now mattered. One of them glanced briefly at Emily, then away, as if reconsidering everything that had just happened. Victoria forced a small smile, attempting to regain control through familiarity. We simply try to ensure that every customer feels comfortable, she said. And sometimes appearances can be misleading. This time, the words landed differently, not as authority, but as an admission she could not fully contain. Daniel gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. They can be, he said. That is why assumptions can be expensive. The sentence settled into the room with quiet finality. No raised voice. No dramatic gesture. Just a truth that carried consequences. Victoria felt the shift completely now. It was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. The control she had relied on had slipped, not through confrontation, but through exposure. Her earlier confidence had depended on certainty about who Emily was. And now that certainty was gone, she glanced briefly toward the entrance, where the black sedan still waited, the driver standing with quiet precision. Then her eyes returned to Daniel, and for the first time, there was hesitation she could not mask. If there has been any offense, she began, her tone carefully softened, we can certainly address it. It was not quite an apology, but it was no longer a command. Emily finally spoke again, her voice calm, steady, unchanged from the beginning. You already addressed it, she said gently. The simplicity of the statement cut deeper than anything else. No anger, no accusation, just a reflection of what had already happened. Victoria's breath caught slightly, the realization settling in fully. This was not a situation she could redirect with politeness alone. The room had seen everything, and now it was waiting to see what she would do next, not as the one in control, but as the one being watched. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, the balance of power was no longer hers to command. The silence that followed Emily's words did not break. It deepened, settling into the room like a truth no one could ignore. Victoria Blake felt it pressing against her, not from one direction, but from every corner of the boutique, from the customers who had stopped pretending not to watch, from the associates who now stood still with careful posture, and most of all from the quiet presence of the man in front of her who had not raised his voice, once yet had shifted everything. She drew in a slow breath, her composure now something she had to actively hold together rather than something that came naturally. For the first time since this began, she understood that this was no longer about removing someone who did not belong. This was about explaining herself in a space where her usual authority no longer applied. Then allow me to correct it, she said, her tone softer now, controlled but undeniably different, as though each word had to pass through a filter of caution. She turned slightly toward Emily, her posture no longer angled downward but leveled, attempting to restore balance in a situation that had already tilted beyond her reach. "You are welcome to stay," she added, the sentence measured, deliberate, but carrying the weight of reversal. A few seconds passed, and in those seconds, the shift became visible. One of the associates subtly adjusted a display again, though nothing needed fixing. Another straightened her name tag, her movements precise, as if small gestures could restore normalcy. But normal had already been replaced by something else. Emily did not respond immediately. She looked at Victoria, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that felt almost distant. It was the calm of someone who had already seen the outcome before it arrived. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. "But that is not really the point." The words landed gently, but they carried more weight than anything said before. Victoria's expression tightened for just a fraction of a second, the realization settling deeper. This was not about permission anymore. It was about what had already been revealed. Daniel remained still beside Emily, his gaze steady, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. He did not need to lead this part. Emily already was. "You decided I did not belong here before I said a single word," Emily continued, her voice even, her tone free of accusation yet impossible to dismiss. "And you were certain about it." The room felt smaller now, the distance between people shrinking under the weight of what was being said. Victoria opened her mouth, but no immediate response came. Because there was no version of that moment she could reshape without acknowledging it. "We make judgments quickly," she said finally, her voice quieter, less certain. Sometimes too quickly. It was the closest she had come to honesty, but it still carried a careful distance, as though she was stepping toward accountability without fully stepping into it. Daniel's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in his posture, a subtle acknowledgement that the truth, even partial, had entered the room. Emily gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as recognition. "Yes," she said, "and sometimes those judgments say more about us than the person we are judging." The sentence settled into the space with quiet clarity. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just a statement that left no room for denial. Victoria felt it fully now, the final piece falling into place. This was not a confrontation she could win. It was a moment she had already lost the second she decided who Emily was without knowing anything about her. Around them, the customers stood in silence, their earlier curiosity now replaced by something more reflective. Even those who had laughed quietly before now avoided eye contact, as if reconsidering their own role in what had unfolded. Victoria lowered her gaze briefly, a small movement, but significant enough to mark the change. When she looked up again, her expression was no longer one of control. It was something more restrained, more aware. "I understand," she said quietly. And for the first time, it sounded real. Emily studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging that the lesson had finally reached its destination. Daniel turned his head slightly toward the associates, his voice calm, but carrying across the room with quiet authority. "I believe we are finished here," he said. No demand, no threat, just a conclusion. And somehow, it carried more finality than anything else that had been said. The room remained still as he stepped back, the tension dissolving not into noise, but into a silence that felt different now, no longer heavy with conflict, but filled with something else entirely. Something that could not be undone. The air in the boutique did not return to normal. It settled into something quieter, more aware, as if every person inside had just witnessed a shift they would not easily forget. Daniel Carter's words lingered, not as a command, but as a conclusion that no one felt the need to challenge. He turned slightly toward the entrance, his posture relaxed, as though the situation no longer required his presence. But Emily Carter did not move immediately. She remained where she stood, her gaze drifting once more across the room, taking in the same polished displays, the same carefully arranged luxury, yet everything now felt different. Not because the space had changed, but because the illusion within it had been stripped away. Victoria Blake stood a few feet away, her shoulders no longer squared with dominance, but held with a quiet restraint that had replaced her earlier certainty. She watched Emily, not with judgment this time, but with something closer to reflection, as if she were trying to understand a moment that had unfolded faster than she could control. For a brief second, it seemed like the scene might simply end there, with silence as the final note. But Emily took a small step forward instead, her movement gentle, unhurried, yet intentional enough to draw attention once more. The room followed her without a sound. She stopped near the same display she had touched earlier, her fingers once again brushing lightly across the leather surface of the handbag, feeling its texture with quiet appreciation. Then she turned back toward Victoria, her expression calm, her voice steady. "This is a beautiful place," she said softly. The statement caught Victoria off guard. It was not what she expected. There was no accusation in it, no lingering resentment, just a simple acknowledgement that seemed almost out of place after everything that had happened. Victoria blinked once, then nodded slightly, unsure how to respond to something that did not demand defense. "It is," she said, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. Emily gave a faint smile, one that carried neither triumph nor submission. "It deserves to be more than just a place where people are judged before they are known." The words landed gently, but they carried a finality that echoed deeper than anything before them. Around them, the customers remained still, absorbing every word, every pause, every shift in tone. Victoria felt the sentence settle in a place she could not ignore. There was no immediate response, no polished line to deflect it, because the truth in it was too clear, too simple to reshape. Daniel watched quietly, his presence no longer at the center, but still grounding the moment. He did not interrupt. He did not add to it. He allowed Emily's words to complete what had already begun. Victoria lowered her gaze briefly, her reflection faintly visible in the polished glass behind the display. When she looked back up, something in her expression had changed. It was subtle, but undeniable. The confidence that once dismissed others so easily had been replaced by something more measured, more aware. "You are right," she said quietly. The admission was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried its own weight simply by existing. Emily held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging that nothing more needed to be said. The lesson had already taken its place. She turned then, stepping back toward Daniel, her movements calm and unhurried. He met her halfway, his eyes softening slightly as he looked at her, a silent understanding passing between them that required no words. Together, they moved toward the entrance, the soft chime above the door sounding once more as it opened. This time, no one looked away. Every person in the boutique watched as they stepped outside into the fading light, the contrast between the quiet interior and the open street beyond more noticeable than before. The black sedan remained waiting, its presence steady, unchanged, but now understood differently by those who had only moments ago seen it as just another passing detail. Inside, Victoria remained where she was, her posture still, her thoughts no longer racing to control a situation, but settling into something deeper. Around her, the boutique slowly began to breathe again, conversations returning in hushed tones, movements resuming with careful awareness. But nothing felt exactly the same, because something had shifted that could not be undone. Not the space, not the people, but the way they saw what stood right in front of them. And in that quiet realization, the room held on to a truth that would linger long after the doors had closed for the night. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware that something quiet yet irreversible had just taken place behind the glass walls of the boutique. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long reflections across the sidewalk as Daniel Carter opened the car door with a calm, practiced motion. Emily Carter paused for a moment before stepping in, her gaze drifting briefly back toward the boutique, not with regret, but with a quiet sense of closure. She did not need to say anything more. The moment had already spoken for itself. Daniel closed the door gently behind her and walked around to the other side, his movements unhurried, composed, as though nothing extraordinary had happened, even though everything had shifted. As the car pulled away smoothly from the curb, its presence faded into the flow of traffic, leaving behind a silence that lingered far longer than its engine ever could. Inside the boutique, that silence remained, settling into the space like a memory that refused to be ignored. Victoria Blake stood where she had been, her reflection faintly visible in the polished glass display beside her. For the first time in a long while, she was not thinking about control or status or maintaining the image she had built so carefully. Instead, she was replaying a moment she could not undo, each word she had spoken now echoing back with a clarity she had not felt before. Around her, the boutique slowly returned to life, but not in the same way. The customers who had witnessed everything moved more quietly now, their conversations softer, more thoughtful. One woman who had earlier glanced at Emily with mild amusement now avoided looking at anyone at all, her attention fixed on a display she was no longer truly seeing. Another customer gently set down a handbag she had been considering, her expression distant, as if reassessing something far beyond the item in front of her. The sales associates, too, carried a different energy. The confident ease they once displayed had been replaced with a careful awareness, their movements more deliberate, their smiles less automatic. One of them approached Victoria cautiously, her voice low. "Should we continue with the appointments?" she asked, as though unsure whether the structure of the day still applied. Victoria did not answer immediately. She watched the door where Emily had stood, the faint echo of that soft chime still lingering in her mind. "Yes," she said finally, though her voice lacked the sharp certainty it once held. The associate nodded and stepped away, but even that simple exchange felt different now, stripped of its usual rhythm. Victoria turned slowly, her eyes scanning the boutique with a perspective she had never needed before. The polished marble, the carefully arranged displays, the quiet luxury that once reinforced her authority now seemed to reflect something else entirely. Not power, not status, but the choices made within those walls. And for the first time, she saw how easily those choices could reveal more than she intended. She walked toward the same display where Emily had stood earlier, her heels softer now against the marble floor. Her fingers hovered over the leather handbag, tracing the stitching in the same way Emily had, though her touch lacked the quiet appreciation that had defined that earlier moment. Instead, there was hesitation, a subtle awareness that this space, once so familiar, now carried a different weight. She said it deserved to be more. Victoria murmured under her breath, the words barely audible, yet unmistakably present. No one responded. No one needed to. The truth of it lingered on its own. Across the boutique, one of the associates greeted a new customer at the entrance, her tone polite, but noticeably warmer than before. The small change did not go unnoticed. Another associate followed suit, adjusting her approach, her voice softer, her attention more genuine. It was not a transformation. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Victoria straightened slightly, her posture returning, though not as rigid as before. There was a difference now, subtle but real. Not in how she appeared, but in how she carried what had just happened. The certainty that once defined her had been replaced by something quieter, something that required awareness rather than assumption. She took one last look around the boutique, the space still elegant, still controlled, but no longer untouched by what had unfolded. And in that quiet shift, something new settled into place, not loud, not dramatic, but lasting. Because sometimes, the most significant change does not come from being challenged in public, but from recognizing, in silence, that the way you see others determines far more than the way they appear. And on that day, in a room built on appearances, the truth had quietly taken its place where it could not be ignored. The boutique closed an hour later than usual that evening, though no one formally decided it should. The last customer had left quietly, the door chimed softer than it had been all day, and the lights remained warm against the marble floors that now reflected only empty space. Victoria Blake stood alone near the center of the room, the silence no longer heavy, but reflective, as if the walls themselves were holding onto everything that had happened. She had replayed the moment more times than she could count, not with defensiveness, but with a clarity that had only arrived after the room had emptied. Every word, every glance, every assumption had unfolded exactly as she had chosen in the moment, and that was what made it impossible to dismiss. It had not been a misunderstanding. It had been a decision. Across the room, one of the associates finished adjusting a display and paused, glancing toward Victoria before quietly excusing herself for the night. There was no tension in the gesture, no fear, just a quiet respect that felt different now, no longer built on authority alone. Victoria nodded once, acknowledging her, and listened as the soft click of the door closing echoed through the boutique. When the sound faded, the stillness that followed was complete. She walked slowly toward the entrance, her heels softer against the floor, her reflection moving alongside her in the glass panels. For years, she had measured success in control, in precision, in the ability to shape every interaction into something predictable. But today had not followed that pattern. Today had revealed something she had not accounted for. She reached the door and paused, her hand resting lightly against the cool glass. Outside, the street had dimmed into evening, the golden light, replaced by the steady glow of street lamps and passing headlights. The world had moved on, as it always did, unaffected by the quiet shift that had taken place inside. But for Victoria, something had changed in a way that could not be undone. She turned back once more, her eyes scanning the boutique with a perspective that felt entirely new. The displays were still perfect. The space was still elegant. But the meaning behind it had shifted. It was no longer just about who belonged. It was about how that decision was made, and who was allowed to make it. Earlier that day, she had believed she understood that completely. Now, she knew she had only seen part of it. She walked back toward the center of the room and stopped at the same display where Emily Carter had stood, her fingers hovering once again over the leather handbag. This time, she did not rush the moment. She traced the stitching slowly, deliberately, as if trying to understand not the object itself, but the difference in how it had been seen. Emily had not touched it as something to possess. She had touched it as something to appreciate. That difference lingered longer than anything else. Victoria exhaled softly, the breath steady, not heavy, but grounding. "We decide too quickly," she said quietly to the empty room, her voice no longer carrying authority, but awareness. The words did not need an audience. They were meant for her. She straightened, her posture settling into something more balanced, less rigid, less performative. It was not a transformation that would be visible to everyone. Not immediately, but it was real, and it was enough to begin. The lights dimmed slightly as the automated system adjusted for closing, casting softer shadows across the boutique. Victoria moved toward the back, her steps unhurried, her thoughts no longer focused on maintaining control, but on understanding what had been revealed. Somewhere in the quiet of that realization, the moment found its final place. Not as a confrontation, not as a loss, but as a turning point that had arrived without warning and left without noise. And long after the doors had closed, long after the lights had dimmed, the truth remained. Simple and undeniable. That day had not been about wealth or status or power. It had been about something far more lasting. The way a person chooses to see another human being. And in the stillness of that empty room, one thing became clear in a way it never had before. Respect is not defined by appearance. It is revealed through how we choose to treat those we believe have none. And that night, in a place built on appearances, that truth remained, quietly, where it could never again be ignored.